What's up, everyone? Kevin Allen here, aka The Geek. I am back to break down the showdown tonight. The Seahawks against the Rams. We've got a Seahawks home game coming up here with the Hawks coming in a slight 2-point favorite. Okay. Very close game, high scoring, 49-point game total. Team totals for each team: Seahawks 25.25, Rams 23.75. So we're expecting lots of scoring. And one thing I just want to say before we get into the players. Seahawks do really well in games where the pace is pushed, as do the Rams. So if this game kind of goes the way the projections, the Vegas implied totals suggest, I do think we'll get a scoring bonanza, and we'll get the good Russell Wilson, the one that throws a lot. And we'll get the good Jared Goff, the one that throws a lot. So we'll see what happens here, but this game sets up really well for these two passing offenses, and just across the board for these scores, which is a pretty cool thing. So I want to mention first that today, in addition to the showdown breakdown, I'm going to be doing a Domination Station tutorial. We've launched a new feature on our live Domination Station Optimizer, where you can now stack either by flex or by captain, and set rules for captain and for flex. Finally, I've been waiting for this for so long. This is a key and very important new feature. If you haven't already done so, make sure you've cleared your cache on the optimizer before you get started. All right, as always, I'm going to start with Fanduel, and before we get into our MVP options and our flex options, just want to kind of go through each player and get an idea of, who they are, how we're going to stack them, and how we're going to use them in various lineups. Now, for Fanduel, quarterback is king, followed by running back in the MVP spot. So we're going to favor our quarterbacks, followed by running backs. If we use a wide receiver in the MVP spot, and we also have their quarterback, we should avoid any pass catchers from the same team. The reason being, if two wide receivers wind up in the Nuts lineup, in the perfect lineup, and one of them winds up as the Nuts MVP, then the reality would be most of the time it would actually go to the quarterback on Fanduel. Because the way scoring works on Fanduel, the quarterback is getting a lot of the same points as the wide receiver. So, yes, one wide receiver can outscore his quarterback if just one does everything, like we saw with Taylor Gabriel a couple weeks ago for Chicago, where he scored 3 touchdowns and no one else did anything. But if anyone else had done anything, it would have been Trubisky who was the nut MVP. So keep that in mind. When we start setting up our rules, you'll see how we do that. But let's take a look at Russell Wilson here. He is our top projected player on the slate. And as you see, whenever Russell Wilson airs it out and starts to throw a little bit more than usual, he tends to produce really good results. He can rush for a touchdown. There was a game here against New Orleans recently where he rushed for 2 touchdowns. So keeping that in mind, we have to consider Wilson in terms of what kind of rule we set for him, where we might not absolutely need to stack him with 2 pass catchers, and I may not, because Russell Wilson can score touchdowns with his legs. There's a reasonable chance he does that. Now, if you want to get a sense of which player can score, one of the things I like to do is I like to jump over to the player props tools. We have one on DFS Army. There's one on the DraftKings Sportsbook that I conveniently have pulled up here, so you can get an idea of the chances of each player scoring a touchdown. And look at Russell Wilson. He's got a plus 350 touchdown prop. Let's see if we can find Jared Goff in here. He's plus 850. So Wilson has a much higher likelihood. Plus 350, I'm going to call that about 20%. And plus 850, we're talking about more like, 6 or 7%. So, with the 20% odds of Wilson scoring a touchdown here, I don't absolutely need to stack him with 2 players that are pass catchers from his team. I don't hate it, but I don't need to. With Goff, I don't really see a whole lot. Again, this plus 850, that works out to, 10% less the premium, so I don't know, 9% or something like that, 8.5% in terms of probability he runs for a touchdown. It could happen, but it's less likely, and so, in the MVP spot, I'm still going to stack Goff with 2 of his pass catchers. It also helps that Goff doesn't spread the football around, whereas Russell Wilson really does. He throws to a lot of different players, and not a lot to any one player. So definitely 2 different approaches there. Going down the list of in the player pool here, we've got Woods, Kupps, and Cook. It's interesting for me that Woods is the most expensive. Don't get it. Kupp has been the best guy. He has the 2nd most targets in the league of any player. I believe at the moment, yeah, see, look, 10, 12, 15, 9. Kupp has just been a fucking beast. Woods has been getting plenty of targets as well, 15 last week, but, he had a 2-bird in there one of these weeks, and he hasn't put it together quite as well as some of the other guys. And then Cooks is always a little more lower volume and a little more boom or bust, as you can see here with the lower target numbers for Brandon Cooks. At the running back position, Chris Carson's going to be sharing a little bit. Sharing is caring. He's going to be sharing with Rashad Penny and CJ Prosise. In terms of the touch count this week, Penny's coming back, so the ceiling's a little bit limited on Carson. I'm not in love with him as a heavy-duty MVP option. I'll take a few shares, but he's not the guy you want to go crazy on in the MVP this week, just because, again, he's probably going to be splitting carries a little bit more than he had been in recent weeks with a couple different guys. Todd Gurley, breakout game last week, 11 targets, 7 receptions, fantastic. We love it. Didn't get a lot of rushing attempts or yards. So still some concern. I mean, if somebody wanted to go full blast Wilson and Goff 60-40 tonight in the MVP, I'm not going to blame you one bit. If you want to go 70-30, whatever you want to do, I'm not going to blame you. I'm not going to make fun of you. I'm not going to rip on you. I don't hate it. I kind of like it. So if you wanted to do that, that's fine. There's not a whole lot else where, MVPs can come from. Cooper Kupp has standalone MVP value. If you look at his scores, though, even in his 2-touchdown massive game, let's see what happened between him and his quarterback. Okay, because this is important. This is the math. So he's got 22 points last week, 27 points the week before, 15 points the week before that. And that was without a touchdown. So 22, 27. Let's see what Goff has done those same weeks and see if, okay, here we go. 23. So Goff only slightly outscored Cooper Kupp last week. Only slightly. The week before, he only scored 16.2. All of the scoring came from Cooper Kupp. So Kupp smashed Goff 2 weeks ago. 16.12. Goff had, Kupp had, I believe, 27. Why? Because he got all of the production. So that can happen when one player gets all of the production. Let's just go see the proof of that. So we said 2 weeks ago, Kupp got all of the production. Well, here you go. Robert Woods, only 3 receptions, 40 yards. Not a whole lot going on there. Was not a nut play. Let's see if Brandon Cooks was a nut play. He got, not bad, 112 yards, 16 fantasy points, still underscored Goff. Still underscored Goff that week. Just passed him with 16.12. So if you had to choose one of these two guys, it would have been Goff. Now it's just interesting how laser focused this offense really is. Because what you're seeing here is Goff basically got all of his production. He did 268 yards 2 weeks ago. 268 yards. Of that, 100 went to Kupp. 120 went to Brandon Cooks. That's 225 or 112, so 220. And then another 40 yards went to Robert Woods. So almost, 95% of what he threw for that game went to just these 3 guys. The point is, if Goff is going to be the MVP, two of them have to be doing really well. Because if not, it's going to be one of those guys that, like another Cup situation where one of them just went off, and he will be the MVP. So be aware of that. Russell Wilson scores in different ways. He can rush the football a little bit more. It doesn't always do it, but when he does, it goes crazy. I think this is one of those games where we might see that. In the high-scoring games, that's where you see Russell Wilson turn it up a lot of the time. And when the Seahawks have a hard time running the football, that's when you see Russell Wilson turning it up. Let's take a look at our Statistical model really quick. This is on the Beat the Bookie website. And I'm just going to jump straight over to the specific rushing yards and passing yard projections here. And if you look at this one, the biggest thing that stands out for me is the Rams get 136 rushing yards projection. Passing yards looks like a little bit favoring the Rams here as well. But again, some of that would be noise from just the style of play. Seattle's style of play is so volatile that, you know, one week they'll just lean on the rush, but if they need to, they could turn up the pass like crazy. Let me just grab the raw numbers here from the model as well. Seattle, yeah, see, rushing and passing, they're showing negative numbers. So a little bit below expectations on a week-to-week basis. And again, that's just the conservative style that Seattle will play and has played this season. Defensively, a little bit better versus the pass than they are versus the rush. And we talk about the Rams. Rams are pretty good defensively against the rush, a little bit better against the rush than they are versus the pass. And their offensive numbers are above average. And especially after last week, those numbers are going to go off. So, going to go up a bit. So those are the basics of what we're looking for and how we're going to set up our stacks. Now, again, Gurley, big week, but didn't do a lot of rushing, so I don't want to go too crazy with Gurley. I'm not ready to say Gurley's back completely, but he's getting most of the workload for this Rams team right now, so he's definitely an MVP candidate as well on Fanduel. Lockett, been up and down this season. But, you know, he has his splash games, getting lots of targets on occasion. Definitely want to mix him in. And finally, Disley. Disley coming off, you know, a string of big games at this point. Now he's double digits every week. Not a MVP candidate, but definitely somebody that I'm going to want to stack with Wilson in those lineups, in a lot of them. So, all right, let's get to the Turd section. But before we get there, the last guy I want to talk about is Legatron. Look at these numbers. These are not normal numbers for a kicker. Okay, this guy's a fucking kicking beast. So, double digits, 9, 10, 13. He's a cash game lock on DraftKings. Just lock him in. He's a cash game lock on FanDuel pretty much. Like, lock this guy into your cash games. It's not 100% that he'll be in the nuts lineup but in tournaments, but I want a lot of exposure to Legatron, and the only way that I really see him not being in the nut lineup is if this game turns into this crazy shootout where so many players are just putting up points like crazy that, you know, they surpass what the kicker can do. And that's happened. We've seen those kind of games before, but Zerline's pretty close to a lock for 8 to 9 fantasy points here, and, you know, the potential for more. So I love Zerline. Myers not doing as much this year, so, you know, 9-3. This is more of like a normal kicker. All right, let's go to the Turd zone. Let's invade the Turdville here and start looking at some of these guys that are Turdly. You know, couple of share type guys. Now, it's very interesting that Everett got 8 targets last week, but let's not go crazy. Last week was a weird week for the Rams. It was a 50-point game or something like that. It was just an unusual week where more targets were just out there for everybody. It doesn't show the final score, but, you know, it was one of the highest scoring games I've ever seen. So let's not go crazy on Gerald Everett. I'm not convinced that he's better than Tyler Higbee. Same shit. He had 7 targets last week, too. He's gotten more targets most weeks. So these are your Turd tight ends. for the Rams, I'm more inclined to go with the cheaper one because I don't think either guy has any sort of chance of putting up one of the 6 best or 5 best scores on the slate type of score. So the only reason you're even using these guys is the hope that paying down enough for one of them will open up an extra stud in your lineup that you couldn't have fit otherwise. If that makes sense. I don't like pairing 2 kickers together. I'm going to definitely favor Zerline quite a bit. DK Metcalf, let's talk about him. Snap share coming down every single week. The return of David Moore even hampers him a little bit more. He is basically a boom or bust play. Again, salary a little high for the boom or bust nature of what we need from him. We're basically going to need this. So, a touchdown at 8K or a very big game from him to make value. It's there, but we don't want to go too crazy with our exposure to Metcalf, being that now the return of David Moore has really affected the playing time for DK Metcalf. Jerron Brown's another one. You know, he's one of these turds that the Seahawks will throw to, and he'll be out there. This is nothing new. We've seen guys like this for years on the Seahawks team. You know, they'll throw a bomb to him. He might catch one and score a touchdown. 3 targets. He's got a few targets each week. So he's cheap enough that we want turd level exposure to him. They're talking about 5-10% max if you're making 150. I wouldn't touch any of these guys in any sort of a cash game environment. There's nothing here at the 5K level that is anything but garbage. So the closest thing we have to a player, let's call it the cheapest viable player here, is David Moore from the Seahawks, 5,500. He is getting increasing snap shares. 2 games since returning from a shoulder injury. Progressing. Increasing his snap load a little bit. So, you know, that's worth a shot. Right? Jerron Brown, too, 6,500. It's worth a shot. And Higbee. Now, again, I'm much more interested in those guys because of the pay-down nature of what they're doing as compared to some of these other ones. Now, CJ Prosise is another guy. He's got like a third down roll working for him. He's not putting up zeros. He's getting you a little something. He actually scored a rushing touchdown last week. You know, the ceiling, again, is very, very low. But the only interest in him, you know, a lot of people didn't want to play Samuels last week, thought the ceiling was low. This is why we play guys like this. He gets that touchdown, and maybe a 7K, you know, 8-point performance is enough to be in the perfect lineup. Again, I'm not sure. Don't want too much of it, but we take a few shots. Trying to see if I missed any players. Josh Reynolds, not interested. These are not numbers that excite me. I mean, maybe, again, 2 or 3% turd level exposure just in case he happens to catch a touchdown at 5,500. That could be a nut play, but it's a super long shot. That's a 150 entry, 3% type long shot. We want to focus on the better players. Now let's jump over to the Domination Station and actually start to craft some lineups for this. And I'm going to show you how I set them up. So before I even jump over there, actually, let's jump over to the coach's notes. We'll see what Josh, DFS Up North, our showdown specialist, has to say. And it looks like he's pretty much on board with a lot of what I was talking about. Wilson, this is Fanduel, Wilson and Goff as primary core captains. MVPs, that is, not captains. Got to get it right. Got to get it right. Sprinkle in a little Carson, a little Hurley-Gurley. I'd throw a little Cooper Kupp in there. Myself, personally. Now, in the main slate, you know, again, high exposure to Kupp, a little bit more conservative Cooks and Woods. Lockett and Disley in here. Zerline, 25-35, that's high exposure. Then our turd zone. 5 to 10%. 5 to 10%. All good stuff. All right, let's jump over to the Domination Station and start to actually set up some lineups. And I'll show you the process of doing this because you never know. Maybe this is the first time watching one of these. So once we open up FanDuel single game Rams Seattle, you'll see the screen. Here's your stack settings. We haven't gotten to that yet. But the first thing I do is try to set up my MVP spot. How do we set up our MVPs? You start here, you click over to MVP. Notice toggle the MVP box to set MVP exposures. Toggle the MVP box. Now we're going to figure out how much exposure we want to each potential MVP. So let's start with Russell Wilson. I like Wilson a lot here. Let's look at the projections too. No, it doesn't hurt you to look at a projection. It's okay. It's okay. It's right here. So Wilson projects at 29.35 versus 29.7 for Goff. So he's slightly higher. I agree with that projection. He's at home. Let's say I go 40% Wilson. And let's say I go 35% Goff. I want to be slightly higher on Wilson than Goff. Not that much, but a little bit. A little bit. Not too much. %35 on Goff. Now I've got 75% of my MVP position covered. I want the little Cooper Cup. I can do 10. That's 85%. Maybe I'll go 10% Gurley and 5% Carson. I don't love Carson here, like I said. I don't think he gets enough volume to really get there, but you never know. And I might change these up a little bit before we finish. I mean, any one of Robert Woods or Cooks could be the nuts play, as could Tyler Lockett. So if you're so inclined to be a little more risk averse, or more so wanting to kind of be different from the field, I would add Woods, Cooks, Lockett, all as potential captain plays as well, you know, at very low ownership. So nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. We've got our MVPs set up. Now I like to set my rules. Okay, so Jared Goff, captain MVP, stacked with no less than 2 players of, and let's get his pass catchers, Kupp, Cooks, Woods, Higbee, and I'm going to surprise you with the last one, Everett. I don't love these guys, but Gurley. Now, why am I including Gurley? Gurley's a pass-catching running back all the way. So there's as good of a chance that Goff throws Gurley a touchdown as it is he throws any of these other guys. So I want him with 2 of these guys. Why? Because without 2 pass catchers going off, Goff is just not going to be the nut captain. Now, with Wilson, I'm going to do, man, this is a tough decision. It really is, because I want to do no less than 2 of, but there aren't 2 pass catchers that I feel like super great about with Wilson. I'm going to do 1. And we're going to have Lockett. We're going to have Disley. Then we have all of these crapola names. I'll have a second rule in a minute, because I don't want 2 craptastic players in the same lineup together. We have a way of doing that. But we'll do David Moore, Jaron Brown, DK Metcalf. See if I forgot anyone. I guess we could talk about pro size. No, I'm not including them. If I did 2 of, I would include pro size, but since it's just 1, I like to include the names of the best potential ones in that rule. There we go. Now we're going to set a couple of other rules. Like Legatron This one is going to be just not to pair up the kickers. I don't like having 2 kickers in the same lineup. Who's the other guy? Myers. Okay, now I'm going to make my turd rules. Okay, This is going to blow your mind. Should not be Captain MVP. This should be regular, so I'm going to change that. Jaron Brown is flex, then stacked with exactly 0 of why am I making this rule? I only want one Turd secondary receiver in any given lineup. I don't want to pile up the Turds. That makes sense. I can't see a bunch of these guys all having big games. You know, it should be the primary guys. For Seattle, there aren't that many primary guys, but these guys are the super Turds. They all split time, so I don't want a ton of that. If I did Tyler Higbee, for example, exactly 0 of, you know, I don't want these Turds being mixed up, so I'd go exactly 0 of Everett and Reynolds, for example. These rules are just designed to make the lineups all be a little bit more viable. We don't want like a lineup loaded with crap. Trying to see who are these other names. I'm going to avoid Gurley with Malcolm Brown. Don't like it. I'm going to avoid Carson with Penny or ProSize. Just avoiding, okay? So these are some of the rules that I'm putting together here. Now, let's run, I don't know, 50 lineups. I always leave it at 1 unique. And the reason I start at 50, I don't want to go too crazy and build a million of them. At the same time, I want to start to get to a sense of who's popping too much in the flex, who's popping too much at MVP, and then I can start to modify my exposures based on just watching it. So here you see the lineups being created in real time. Okay? We can see our entire exposure right here. So we've got 98% exposure to both Wilson and Goff. Lots of Todd Gurley, lots of Lockett, Metcalf, etc., etc. Well, who am I not getting? Where's my boy Cooper Kupp? There he is. So way too much of some of these Turds, like a DK Metcalf. Way too much of Tyler Higbee. So we're getting a little too much Turdliness. Not enough goodness. First of all, not enough Zerline at all. You asked me, how do I know this? I just broke down the entire slate. So, I mean, talked about who I like more and who I don't. So we're going to start to control these exposures, both through likes and loves and adores, adjustments to the projection system for all intents and purposes, and also max exposure limits. Now, one of the things you might say is, well, how do you control the exposures? Right now we have both quarterbacks in every single lineup. I don't really want that in every single lineup. So I tab over to the flex. I see that Goff is showing up 34% of the time in the MVP. And 64% of the time in the flex. So if I want to reduce my total Goff exposure, I could set him to 40% flex. And, you know, with Russell Wilson, same deal. I have a lot more MVP exposure, so I can set him 35% in flex. Right? Tyler Lockett, that's a lot. I want to make sure that every Tyler Lockett lineup is with, if Lockett has Russell Wilson in it, if Lockett's going off, Russell Wilson probably have a good game. Let's run it again. I've made a few adjustments. We're going to see what happens. Now I'm getting way too much Tyler Lockett this time. It's probably because the early lineups were probably Russell Wilson lineups. And we have our next result. So we're getting a little bit closer. This is, again, a little bit more DK Metcalf than I'm comfortable with. I'm going to max him out at 20%. I'm just going to start to set some max exposure limits. Again, that's more Carson that I probably want exposure to. I'm going to set him at 30%. Legatron, he's coming up a little bit. I like that. Higbee, where anybody good? Yeah, let's David Moore. I'm going to raise his projection up a bit. Will Disley, I'm going to raise that up a bit. And we run it again. That's how I do it. Make a few adjustments. I want to start to see the exposures where I want to see them. Again, one place where I'm figuring out what my exposure should be. Again, I'm jumping back over to my NFL props. I'm kind of looking, all right, who can score a touchdown here? Who's got the highest odds of touchdowns? Right here you're going to see Metcalf and Disley very similar. They're giving Brown a pretty reasonable chance at a touchdown in this week. Cooks and Woods, though, lower. Penny very low. Jerron Brown very low. So, but not terrible, Jerron Brown. Jerron Brown slightly above David Moore. So we're going to want to get a little more of him. But we have to look at salary. And these guys already basically are such long shots that ain't going to happen. So this is your super turd levels, right? These guys aren't scoring touchdowns, or it's very unlikely. And if you think they will, bet this. Because plus 2,000 is fucking 20 times your money. So like I could bet $100 and make back 2,200 if Mike Thomas scores a touchdown. Or 20 times your money. Or 11 times your money. Bet it if you think it's going to happen. Everett and Higbee, they're giving Everett a little slightly higher odds. No wonder Everett's a little more expensive. But Jerron Brown, David Moore, coming in plus 425, plus where am I? Plus 600, so not super likely. We don't want too much exposure to these guys. And it's interesting, DK Metcalf, man, woo, plus 150, I'm surprised. So we're going to have to raise that up actually a little bit, because quite honestly, that's a little bit surprising for me. I actually think that number is bad. I would like to bet the under on it. I don't think he's got a, 60, or I don't think he has like a 40% chance of scoring a touchdown here. That's crazy. But, I mean, I guess it's reflected in the numbers. I'll have to go up a little bit here, I guess, unfortunately. So, David Moore, who's the other guy? We got to keep running this. So anyway, that's the process of getting the tool set up. I'm not going to go through the entire process of how I'm going to set up my tool for tonight. I will be finishing that up after this video is done. But you guys get a pretty good idea. Now let's jump over to DraftKings real quick and take a look at that. All right, let's shift over to DraftKings real quick, and we'll start with taking a look at the coaches' notes for the DraftKings Showdown and see where we are in terms of some of these exposures. So Josh has Cooper Kupp as your top, one of the top exposures here with 20 to 25%. A little bit of Cooks, a little bit of Goff in there, a little bit of Wilson, Gurley, and Tyler Lockett. Now, one thing I'm going to add to this. I can see a path to Greg Zuerlein winding up here, and that path is actually really interesting. That path probably happens most likely if the game is high scoring to the point where that extra savings you had from not putting an expensive captain, I'll show you. When you do the captain spot, if you use any of these, let's say I use Cooper Kupp, right? So, you're eating up a lot of the salary cap, right? And now I'm going to use, a couple salary savers. So throw Zuerlein in there. He's way underpriced in this matchup. Throw Zuerlein in there. I still need another cheap guy in here. So, I got to use a Jerron Brown or something to make it all work. And then I can start to squeeze in, Lockett and Wilson and you know, things like that. So we can work it out like that. That's with the Cooper Kupp in there. Now, if I use somebody cheap in the captain spot, like a Zerline, who's only 5K, I've got 8,900 left, so I can kind of load up on some talent in a different way here. Like I could go Disley, you know, Woods, Carson, quarterback. So you can create a different combination with a really cheap guy up here. So in the situation where Woods, Cooks, Carson, Wilson, and Goff all go off in a particular, and this wouldn't be my mix. I'd want to get, you know, like a Tyler Lockett in here maybe as well. So something like that, and you know, I'd want it a little bit different than this just to match up Wilson with Lockett, maybe a Disley. Something like that. The point is that using a kicker here could work, but it's not likely to. It's not likely to. The best way to go is always to get a pass catcher. So, again, we've already talked about the potential for some of these players, but we want to talk a little bit DraftKings specific strategy. When you're looking at this one, yeah, it's highly unlikely that a quarterback is actually going to wind up as the Nuts captain unless two of their pass catchers. It's even more dramatic on DraftKings than it is on Fanduel. You almost need 3 pass catchers to go off, or the quarterback to do just some incredible things for them to wind up as the Nuts captain. Not only because of the way scoring works, but because these quarterbacks are also the highest priced. And that's the dirty little secret. So they limit you more than the other positions. And again, you could just see by the scoring of Russell Wilson, 44-28 in his 2 big weeks. Let's look at his wide receiver. 35. That was when Wilson scored 28. So it's not to say that Wilson couldn't outscore him. Wilson rushed for 2 touchdowns, I believe, last week. That week. 2 touchdowns, and it took that for Wilson to outscore him. So it can happen. But something crazy usually has to happen for that to go down that way. Same thing if you look at Cooper Kupp. 29, 36, 20, 30, 30, 36, 20. Last 3 games. Let's look at Jared Goff. Underscored Kupp, underscored Kupp, underscored Kupp. Every single week. So, and he's more expensive. So my point is, it's much more likely that a pass catcher on DraftKings, or even a Gurley type, if he's going to catch 11 passes, will outscore the quarterback position. So these are the guys we want to focus on, and setting up the Domination Station. Again, I'd use the same rules as we did in the last one. Essentially, if a quarterback is the captain, I want at least 2 of his pass catchers in the lineup with him. I probably want to limit kickers to just 1 in each lineup. I just don't, 2 could be there, but it's really unlikely. So I really want to limit it to 1, and I'm going to focus on using a lot of Zerline. Now, I think one last thing I'm going to talk about here is cash game approach. How are we going to attack cash games? Well, we want the highest floor players in our cash lineup. These are the dudes. These are your highest floor guys. Maybe put a Gurley in there. We've got only 7,400 left, so at the captain, so you don't want to work it this way. So now we got to choose between one of these players to be our captain, right? So let's take Wilson and put him in there. Oh, captain, captain. We've only got 2,100 left. What do we do? Well, we have to make a choice. Either we drop down to a second high floor player. Let's say Jason Myers, probably get a 6 points. 6 to 8 points. Could do that. That's cool. That's cool. Let's see if you did that. Now, I normally don't like to have 2 kickers, but it does help your prospects on DraftKings to have 2 kickers because they're cheap and they have a high floor. But we could put CJ Procise in there a little cheaper. He's going to get a couple of targets in the passing game usually. So he's playable. I don't really want to give up Kupp, Goff, or Wilson, but, you know, we could switch them around. I'd rather have the quarterback in a cash game in the captain spot because they have the highest floor. You know, Cooper Kupp could just have a bad game and get you, you know, like a 6 or a 9. Didn't do much. But Russell Wilson's very unlikely in this spot to have that level of a bad game. So his floor is higher. So this is a risk tolerance thing. Both Robert Woods and Cooks, they're capable of having a bad game. Sometimes you want to just throw in a super turd so you can afford someone great. Lockett or Carson or any one of these guys. So you could throw in a turd like this, but the problem is you have to expect a 0. Now he's getting a couple looks for 1,400, so playable. Jerron Brown. If you do that, you can have your choice of the final spot. You could put Lockett in here again to match up with Wilson. You can go with Gurley, maybe a higher floor. Not sure. It's a tough one. Normally it'd be Gurley if he was like the workhorse, but we don't know. Carson, I don't know. Going to get some touches. Going to get some scores. It's playable. Any one of these guys. So that's a cash game approach that could be used. I definitely would want to use both running backs. And again, I might rather go with the other kicker. He probably has a higher floor, definitely than Brown. But the negative with that situation is if you do that, as you can see here, and I have Wilson here, I'd have to switch from Wilson to Kupp, which increases my risk at the captain spot. But if I did that, if I switch from Wilson to Kupp and then I put Wilson over here, I could still afford like a Cooks or a Disley. So that's another way of going about it. That's how you handcraft them. Obviously, if you're going to attack some of these contests, I want to show you guys a couple of the contests that you can have some fun attacking today without much risk. If you look at Fanduel, 5-cent game, 25-cent game, big time, $9 game, got a $1 game, got pretty much whatever you want. They even opened up another $9 game. So it looks like they're expecting to fill it. Got a $3 game. You have a lot of choices here. One cool thing, if you look at the second half only contest, I had a little bit of luck with this last week. There was a satellite that paid out some really cool ticket value. I'm not seeing it here right now, but they'll probably open this later. But I definitely saw, I saw satellites along this line, but with tons and tons of overlay last week. They might have stopped doing them. We'll see. On DraftKings, if you take a look at the lobby right now, there should be a mini-max. 50 cents to enter. Not doing that right now. I had the sports book on, and of course it's going to screw me over with this thing. So anyway, I don't like doing that. So anyway, there's a mini max with 50-cent game to enter. There are some cheaper games that you can do 20 entry on. So lots of fun opportunities to attack tonight's game. Have fun with it. Again, build a lot of lineups for these mass multi-entry tournaments. Build just a few for hybrid, sort of smaller contests, kind of like what I showed you, the cash game approach. And then if you play cash, build for a high floor. That's it for this one, guys. Good luck tonight.